These slides present Chapter 8 of Economics After the Crisis. This chapter is about labor markets. This is quite a long chapter because all theories are explained in the labor supply part and again in the labor demand part. And at the end they come together in the third section on unemployment and wages. We distinguish labor between human capital, which is often limited to paid work only, and human capability, which is expressed both through paid work and through unpaid work. Let's begin with defining the labor force. The labor force consists of employed and unemployed people who are willing and able to work. In social economics, we recognize that the supply of labor to the labor market is produced. We refer to this process as reproduction. The actual size of the labor supply is determined by many social factors. In institutional economics, we recognize that there are many constraints to labor supply. In particular, social norms, for example, gender norms. They reduce the supply of women to the labor market. In post-Keynesian economics, labor supply is regarded as endogenous in two ways, not only as a produced production factor through reproduction, but also as a reaction to the economy as a whole. For example, we distinguish the discouraged worker effect, underemployment, and the added worker effect. This diagram gives you a picture of the size of the labor force in South Africa in the year 2013. Fortunately, we see many more people employed as compared to unemployed, but still there's 4.7 million people unemployed. There's discouraged workers, more than 2 million people. And there are people who are not active, either because they're students, or they're ill, or they may be doing lots of unpaid or voluntary labor. In neoclassical economics, labor supply is regarded to be exogenous, simply determined by population growth. And labor supply is not much influenced by social norms or institutions, but reacts to the wage rate. The higher the wage rate, the more labor supply, and the lower the wage rate, the lower labor supply. This diagram shows the backward bending labor supply curve. Remember from many market diagrams that the supply curve generally is upward sloping. This one is upward sloping in the middle part, but it's downward sloping for very low wages at the bottom and also downward sloping for very high wages at the top. Now we move to the various theoretical explanations and examples of labor demand. In social economics, we analyze labor demand with two important concepts: segmentation of the labor market and discrimination in the labor market. Segmentation can occur horizontally and vertically. Vertical segmentation basically means that the labor market is split between a high wage, high opportunity part and a low wage, low opportunity part. Horizontal segmentation is between different types of occupations. When we talk about the typical jobs that migrant workers do, well, this is a type of horizontal segmentation. They can be found in some agricultural, labor-intensive work, for example, or in cleaning jobs. Discrimination is unfair. I think we all agree on that. But what is interesting in social economic analysis, that economists have demonstrated that it's not only unfair, but also inefficient. Look at the example. This shows you the demand for truck drivers. Suppose there's a scarcity of truck drivers. So you basically hired all the high-skilled male truck drivers. That's the gray shaded part. So who to hire next? Is between high-skilled female truck drivers or low-skilled male truck drivers. Now, any rational employer would hire the high-skilled women. But when we look at real labor markets for truck drivers, we see that that is not happening. Why not? Well, discrimination plays a role. Not only discrimination because many girls are socialized not to become a truck driver, of course. But why not? The institutional economic analysis of labor demand looks at the structuring of labor markets. For example, there are some internal labor markets rather than outside labor markets where firms hire from. There's also an important recognition of a particular type of discrimination, and that is statistical discrimination, where individuals are discriminated against simply because they are member of a group and they're only judged on the basis of the group average rather than on their own merits. This table shows you the types of labor contract that we currently see in the Republic of South Africa. The diagram distinguishes between the type of formality of a contract and the time duration of a contract. The columns distinguish between women and men. The table summarizes important labor market institutions and their effects on workers and employers. As you see, some institutions have positive effects and some have negative effects. Labor rights work out positively for workers, but negatively for employers. They're often costly. Discrimination works out negatively for workers, but also negatively for employers because it's inefficient, as we have seen earlier. In post-Keynesian economics, the demand for labor depends on the state of the economy. When the economy is on the top of the cycle, there's high demand for labor. But when it's at the bottom of a cycle, during a recession or even a crisis, there's low demand for labor. The implication is that low wages will not help to solve unemployment. Unemployment will only be solved when the economy moves up along the economic cycle. Let me explain the neoclassical theory of labor demands by going back to the example of Roberto's pizza restaurant from chapter 4. What is important here is that the marginal product of labor multiplied with the price of labor, that's the wage rate, gives you the value of the marginal product of labor. I'm sure you will recognize this table from chapter 4. Remember, the most two important columns are the last two columns of marginal cost and marginal revenue. And remember, marginal revenue was the price per pizza, €6. Now, you will also remember that profit maximization is that point where marginal cost equal marginal revenue. So this is when you hire more or less 6 students. The marginal cost will be €5 and the marginal revenue will be €6. The next table shows you column 4 with a marginal product of labor. This is every time the difference in column 2. So from 0 to 10 it's 10, from 10 to 24 it's 14, and so on. Column 5 gives you the value of the marginal product of labor. So we have to multiply this with the price of pizzas sold. That is €6 per pizza. So 10 times 6 is 60. 14 times 6 is 84, and so on. The last column gives you the wage rate. If you remember, this was €25 per student per evening. Profit maximization is exactly at a point where the value marginal product of labor and the wage rate are more or less equal. So let's see, wage rate of 25. It's closest to 30, and it happens when Roberto hires 6 students. Aha, so it's exactly the same result as the marginal cost is marginal revenue formula. This diagram shows you the curve for the demand for labor. It's a relationship between wage on the vertical axis and the amount of labor hired on the horizontal axis. As you see, it's a rather steep curve, implying that the elasticity for the demand of labor is relatively low. The table on this slide shows you the unemployment rates for different groups in South Africa. You will probably not be surprised to see some discrimination and some differences in human capital reflected here. The unemployment rate among blacks is 29% and among whites only 6%. For women it's 28% and for men 23%. In other words, this shows you a highly segmented labor market. Social economics focuses on segmentation, both in the analysis of unemployment and in the analysis of wages. Wage discrimination is explained in social economics through segmentation, either by a theory of compensating wage differentials or by the dominant gender division of labor between men and women, or by the crowding hypothesis, leading some people to crowd in very few occupations, driving the wages down there. In institutional economics, wage institutions are crucial for the analysis of the labor market, and in particular, effective minimum wages. That is, minimum wages that are above market wages. This table shows you the minimum wages for domestic workers in South Africa in the year 2013. As you see, there's a difference between the hours that domestic workers work, less or more than 27 hours per week, and there's a difference between the wage level in urban areas and rural areas. They're a bit higher in urban areas because the cost of living is higher in urban areas. Efficiency wages are wages around the minimum wage level that have all kind of positive economic effects. They stimulate productivity and motivation, and they lead to less labor conflict. In post-Keynesian economics, all unemployment is involuntary. Even when somebody who's unemployed offers his labor to an employer for a lower rate than the wage rate, he will not be hired because the employer doesn't need more labor. In this slide, we combine the backward bending supply curve and the steep labor demand curve. As you will see, this helps you to find the points in the labor market where wages are determined for different groups in the labor market. For low wage earners at the bottom of the diagram and for high wage earners at the top of the diagram. The second diagram shows you what happens with changes. In this case, a shifting out of the labor demand. So let's suppose the economy is growing fast. There's more demand for labor. Now at the top of the diagram, you see that this leads to lower wage rates, not to higher wage rates. In the middle of the diagram, you see that it leads to a higher wage rate from B to D. Whereas at the bottom of the diagram, the poorer workers, they don't notice anything of an improvement of the economy. Neoclassical economists recognize that in unemployment there is some voluntary unemployment, meaning those people who are not willing to work at the going wage rate or a lower wage rate. This diagram shows you what happens in a neoclassical world when there is a minimum wage that is effective, meaning above the market wage. This minimum wage creates unemployment because at the minimum wage, the labor demand is lower than the labor supply. And unemployment then is the difference between the labor supply and the labor demand. In the final slide, we analyze unemployment a little bit further in neoclassical economics. So the diagram has shown you that with a minimum wage, there's unemployment of the size of the distance between LB and LA. Now the question is how to solve this unemployment. Most neoclassical economists will simply say, abolish the minimum wage rate, and we're back at a lower market wage rate and equilibrium, and all unemployment is gone. Well, what about shifting the labor demand curve to the right? That's indeed another solution to the unemployment problem. How can that be done? How can we stimulate employers to hire more workers and not lower their wages? Well, flexibilization of the labor market, making job contracts very short, hiring day labor instead of people on longer-term contracts. That makes labor more flexible, it's easier to hire, but also easier to fire people. Is this an ideal solution? Socially, certainly not, but even economically, there are some question marks, because lots of flexibilization of work tends to reduce the motivation of workers, and they tend to move on from job to job as soon as they see a better job opportunity coming along. This leads to transaction cost, because when people more often switch jobs, employers need to spend more time and effort and money on training new workers.